Great. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming, both in person and online, to this week's GISS lunch seminar. I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Molly Menzel. So Molly just started a NASA postdoctoral program fellowship in early October. So she's been here for about 1 month. She received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University back in May. And her advisor was Dr. Darren Woff. So Molly is doing some very interesting work looking at connections between the Brewer-Dobson circulation in the stratosphere and between the troposphere, especially the upper tropical troposphere. So she's going to give a presentation summarizing some of those results. She's writing a manuscript about this. So just a few details. People in person, if you have any questions, obviously just raise your hand. And then people online, if you have a question, just enter that in the chat. And either I can indicate if you want me to unmute you, or you can just write the question and I'll repeat it. So with that, I think we can take it away.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Claire, for inviting me to share what I'm working on, what I have been working on, but also where this work is going in the future. And as she mentioned, we're preparing this for submission for publication. So I would love any feedback that anyone may have. Yeah, and just to echo, if you have any questions, just jump in. No need to wait till the end. I'd rather clarify as we go. So, before, of course, as an introduction, I really want to highlight the circulation features of the most interest to this work. And so, of course, in the troposphere, that starts with our Hadley cells. Of course, it's a major aspect of circulation in the troposphere. And in particular, the upward branch of the Hadley cell, as that air circulates forward, its distance to the axis of rotation of the Earth is decreasing, and so we have a increase in zonal winds with latitude due to angular momentum conservation. And so we typically see the subtropical jets at the latitude of the Hadley cell, and the subtropical jets are as you may know, a local maximum in zonal winds in the upper troposphere, and particularly, and then also, although this talk does not cover much of mid-latitude circulation, we do have some atmospheric turbulence in the mid-latitudes. Those eddies prompt the propagation of planetary and synoptic scale waves into the stratosphere, and require the westerly zonal wind to propagate. And where those, particularly in the lower stratosphere, where those waves break in the tropics, this induces an upwelling motion in the lower stratosphere. And so that's a little arrow by the tropopause. And this upwelling induces the stratospheric circulation that we call the Brewer-Dobson circulation. And unlike the Hadley cells, this Brewer-Dobson circulation does travel from the equator all the way to the poles. And so these are the major features we are focusing on in this talk. And in particular, there's been a lot of interest in how these circulation features are responding to CO2. And I'm going to go through all of those responses independently. The first one that's probably gained a lot of interest, or perhaps the most interest in recent decades, is that of the Hadley cell expansion. Perhaps this is no surprise, as the Hadley cell width is a huge reason for our global patterns of precipitation, in particular where the subtropical dry desert zones lie. And so there's been a lot of work understanding the expansion of the tropics, or the expansion of the Hadley cell edge. And here I'm really just highlighting a recent paper by Grimes and Davis that looks at that expansion in CMIP-5 and CMIP-6 models. And so the figure on the left is in the northern hemisphere, so a poleward shift is positive. In the southern hemisphere, a poleward shift is negative. And you see that this response is very consistent for both CMIP-5 and CMIP-6 models, and across all seasons. In fact, well, I would say all seasons except for the northern hemisphere, June, July, August, there's actually a reverse pattern there. We're not going to dive into that. All this is to say, this is a very robust result, and it's gained a lot of attention. one of the lesser understood responses to CO2 in the Hadley cell is that of the upwelling. So this upwelling region at the equator, it's actually expected to narrow and strengthen. And one paper that documents this well is Lau and Kim 2015, where this bottom plot is showing the change in response to CO2. And you can notice an increase in the string function right at the equator. And this is what they consider or call a deep tropics squeeze. And so this is a narrowing of the convective zone. You can think of it as a narrowing of the intertropical convergence zone and an enhanced ascent, or perhaps a strengthening of that circulation. However, this result is not necessarily robust, and the robustness is still in question. There's a subsequent paper by Michael Byrne that looks at the intertropical convergence zone in all the CMET5 models and shows that the model mean response to CO2 is actually a narrowing and a weakening of the ITCZ. However, take that with a grain of salt because the CMET5 models show a large spread in the response. So you have a handful of models that are strengthening and narrowing. You have a handful of models that are expanding and weakening, and it's about a third in each quartile. So understanding this upwelling is a bit of a gap in current research. So this is something that we're trying to look into a little bit more. In addition to changes to the Hadley cell, we also, in response to CO2, see a lifting of the circulation, so a lifting of the Hadley cells, but also a lifting of the tropopause. And this is, I think, shown very well from this Ballas et al. 2014 paper, where the plot on the right is showing the trends in the tropopause with a 1% CO2 forcing. And so you can see that through the CMET5, all models are showing an increase in the tropopause height, and then the model mean is shown in black. Not only will we see that increase in height of the tropospheric circulation, we also see a strengthening of the subtropical jet. And this is my previous work focused a lot on this response of the subtropical jet to CO2. Whereas this plot is showing the zonal wind's response to an abrupt quadrupling of CO2. And so the subtropical jet strengthens by about 5 meters per second in the southern hemisphere and 1.6 in the northern hemisphere. And also we found that the strengthening of the subtropical jet responds to any form of warming in the tropics. So be it a ENSO-like warming that is perhaps narrow in structure, you see a strengthening of the subtropical jet, but also a broader global warming. You also see a strengthening of the subtropical jet there. That concludes the responses to the tropospheric circulation features of interest. If we move on to the stratosphere, there's been a lot of interest in the acceleration of the Brewer-Dobson circulation. This acceleration also coincides with a narrowing of that lower stratospheric upwelling. Perhaps you may be familiar with the narrowing of a turnaround latitude or critical latitude. And this response, I think, is well visualized by this paper from Ballas et al. 2020. This is showing the residual string function response to CO2. And this is just in Wacom, but the paper looks at 6 CCMI models and shows consistent results across them all. Whereas the orange is a positive strengthening, the blue is a strengthening because it's a negative value. And so you see the strengthening of the circulation, but I think this plot also does a good job of showing there seems to be a strengthening of the circulation in the upper troposphere as well. So it's not just excluded to the stratosphere. And so a lot of prior work has looked at these circulation responses individually, and there's been extensive work trying to understand them. However, there seems to be a lack of understanding how these changes interact with one another, or perhaps the potential couplings between these responses. And also there still lacks a robust understanding of the dynamics that are responsible for all of these changes. And so in particular, our focus is looking at the upper tropospheric upwelling and this lower stratospheric upwelling, as the research that looks at the lower stratosphere doesn't really consider or identify the upper tropospheric upwelling, and vice versa. But I would also argue that there hasn't been a lot of work looking at the upper tropospheric upwelling response in general. And so our motivating question here is really to understand what are the couplings between this tropical tropospheric and stratospheric circulation changes in response to CO2. And so our analysis of response to CO2, it is comprised of looking at 4 different types of response patterns, if you will. So we look at the seasonality of the response, the hemispheric patterns, or perhaps hemispheric asymmetry of response. We look at how each feature responds in its scaling with CO2. So if you have a larger forcings, you have a larger response. And then we also look at the transient response. So how quickly do these responses happen? And the approach here is that as we look at all of these aspects of response for each feature, if 2 features are well coupled, then they should demonstrate the same patterns across all these aspects. Or otherwise, if perhaps 2 features show different timescales of response, perhaps they are decoupled in their response. So today, I'm going to spend most of my time looking at the seasonality and the hemispheric patterns of response. I will also show a little bit of the timescale, but that's not going to be the dominant focus. And I'm also using output from the GISS ModelE, or 2.1, which I do not have to tell this group is a low model or a low top model. But it also, the simulation suite that we're using is forcing we're using a forcing, an abrupt forcing of varying degrees of CO2. So from 2 all the way to 8 times CO2. This output was provided by Clara and also Ivan Mateski. They use the suite of simulations to really understand linearity of circulation response. We are not diving into linearity necessarily, but we are seeing how these features scale with the CO2 magnitude. And then I also want to go through some of the metrics I'm using. There are a handful of metrics, so I think it's worth describing how they are calculated. So this plot on the right is just showing the climatology of the atmosphere, in particular December, January, February, which you'll notice because the upwelling of the Hadley cell is in the southern hemisphere. So yeah, maybe I should describe here. The gray contours are showing our mean meridional circulation. It is the Eulerian mean in the troposphere, but in the stratosphere, it's plotting the residual stream function. And then the colored contours are showing the zonal mean, zonal wind. And so to start with the tropospheric metrics we're looking at, we look at the meridional stream function in the upper troposphere. So that's between 100 and 300 hectopascals in this swath. And if we vertically average that, you'll see the pink line in the top plot. We find where that stream function, or that average of the stream function, is maximized in the north and southern hemispheres. And where that maximum occurs, that is what we call the width of our upwelling, because that maximum is our inflection point for vertical motion upwards versus vertical motion downwards. So those are the bounds of the upwelling motion. And then, so we find its width, but we also find its magnitude, and that's what we are calling our strength of upwelling. To define the subtropical jet, we actually calculate an adjusted wind profile. So we vertically average the zonal mean zonal winds from 100 to 400 hectopascals, and then we subtract the 850 hectopascal wind. And this adjusted wind profile is really used to distinguish the subtropical jet from the eddy-driven jet for all the seasons where the eddy-driven jet may otherwise mask the subtropical jet. And so this is shown in the blue line in the top. We just find where that's maximized. It's most equatorward peak. That's our that maximum value is our strength of the subtropical jet. And then we also find the Hadley cell edge. Although perhaps not a focus of our study, we want to see if the results are consistent with the work that's done prior. And so we use a psi 500 metric. It takes the 500 hectopascal stream function, shown in the gray, and finds where it crosses zero just north and south of the extrema in each hemisphere. And this is perhaps the most common metric used to define Hadley cell edge. For the stratospheric metrics, we actually have pretty analogous metrics. So in order to calculate the width and strength of the lower stratospheric upwelling, we find the residual stream function at 70 hectopascals. That's in the light green line. We find its latitude. That is also known as a turnaround latitude for all of the prior research. And then we calculate the magnitude of that stream function at those latitudes, and that is our strength. And so this the strength of the upwelling is very similar or very comparable to the upward mass flux calculation. We also define a critical latitude. So this is where the zonal wind at 70 hectopascals, shown in the blue, crosses zero. And this is trying to get a little bit more mechanistically as to the width of the upwelling. You may recall that the planetary and Snodgrass scale waves that propagate upward can only propagate in a strong enough zonal westerly flow. And so where the winds change from westerly to easterly, that stunts the ability for those waves to propagate and creates a bounds for that wave breaking. And so this critical latitude is used as an approximation for where those waves are breaking. And then we also defined a lower stratospheric metric, lower stratospheric winds metric. So this is another form of calculating the subtropical zonal winds. We vertically average this zonal winds from 100 to 70 hectopascals. And then at 25 degrees north and south, we just calculate its value. And so this is just another way to quantify what's happening with the zonal winds response. So these are the metrics we're using. I also want to show the visualization of how the atmosphere, the zonal mean circulation, is responding to CO2. So to do that, I am showing the response to an abrupt quadrupling of CO2. And this is pretty representative of all of the abrupt forcings. In this plot, you see the very characteristic warming of the upper tropospheric tropics, also the cooling with height. What does this look like with the zonal winds? Oh, I should also point out, again, we're focusing on the DJF climatology in these plots. We see a strengthening of the zonal winds in the stratosphere and also a strengthening of the subtropical zonal winds. They strengthen by about 5 meters per second. And if we look at the change in meridional stream function, we see a very strong strengthening, a very large strengthening in the upper troposphere of the mean meridional circulation. And then a little bit more subtly, so this upper tropospheric strengthening is about 3/10 to the 10 kilograms per second. A little bit more subtly is a strengthening of the stratospheric circulation by about 1.6, 10 to 9 kilograms per second. But I want to point out this pattern briefly, because if you notice, so the strengthening in the upper troposphere is very pronounced. However, perhaps a little bit less pronounced or more difficult to see is there is actually a slight weakening in the mid to lower troposphere. And so to visualize this, I actually calculate the strength and width of the upwelling as a function of latitude. So that is shown in these plots for DJF and June, July, August, both hemispheres. Here, the red dots are showing the width of the upwelling, and the diamonds, the pink diamonds, are showing the strength. And so we can see very distinctly that if you look at the upper troposphere above 300 hectopascals, you see one response, mostly that the upwelling is narrowing and strengthening. But then if you look at the mid to lower troposphere below 300 hectopascals, there's actually an opposite response where the upwelling definitely appears to weaken and perhaps also looks to widen, or perhaps there's no change.
And I'll just make a comment for the top right panel, that disconnect, and we would suspect in other models would even be stronger, because the fact that those pink diamonds aren't to the left is maybe reflective of the fact that in these simulations the AMOC collapses, and that has an indirect impact on the Hadley circulation.
So this is like the transient feature when it collapses, because the end of those simulations it comes back again, right?
Not in these runs.
Really?
What she was saying,
Not
it was like
4 times
800.
CO2.
The 4 times
Years.
comes back after like 700 years.
Oh, well, but it depends on how long you run it out for.
Oh.
So yeah, she's talking about 150
Yeah.
year long simulations.
Yeah. Our steady state is just that, from 100 to 150 years. So yeah, the longer response wouldn't show up here. Yeah, and then it is interesting that like that's the exception to this pattern. That
Yeah,
it's
so
the
we think that's a model specific result, but generally that what you're showing in the bottom left, that disconnect, we suspect many models would be showing that.
Yeah, but the question that I have, I've only looked at this in this GISS model. I'm wondering if the level of inflection is different from model to model.
So the 2 times doesn't have that feature.
What feature?
The AMOC collapse. Are you saying that the AMOC
weakens
collapse
then
is causing the lower troposphere to behave in this different way?
Yes.
Right.
So the collapse of the AMOC in our model is associated with an anomalous acceleration of the Hadley cell, which acts to kind of compensate what we would expect would be a weakening of it.
So if she made these same plots, this is the 4 times. If she made the same plots for the 2 times, would it not show that feature?
Yeah, we may see something. Yeah, we may see more of that disconnect in the top right panel. But then we'd have a weaker signal, and I mean 4 times is better because you just want to kick the system a little bit harder. But this was just I don't mean to distract from the main point. I just wanted to clarify that that may be
if the AMOC collapse is model specific, then yeah.
What?
Well, you just could confound it. The 2 times that doesn't have that confounding your signal, but it's a smaller signal to start with. But
yeah.
I don't know.
So if she's looking at the 4 times CO2 runs because that's what one wants to look at for the forcing. But then there are also some of these other potential model specific features like the AMOC collapse, which add an additional layer of nuance. But generally, this kind of disconnect between upper and lower levels that she's showing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that I highlight in this work, is that there is this disconnect between upper tropospheric metrics like subtropical jet, this upwelling we're looking at, and mid to lower tropospheric metrics like Hadley cell edge, eddy-driven jet, where the surface wind crosses 0. But I don't know if it's obvious to me that the upwelling in the mid to lower troposphere is necessarily dynamically tied to those other metrics. I don't want to assume that, because I feel like assumptions like that have been proven incorrect. And so that's worth looking into for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think this is an interesting point, and this is actually not something I've seen in any prior work. But some of the work that has looked at, say, the intertropical convergence zone, they're using a very similar metric, but they're looking at the upwelling between 300 and 700 hectopascals. And so that's this red box here. And so you see that if in this GISS model, if you were looking only at that level, you would find that the upwelling is widening and weakening. However, I mean, for our purposes, we care about what's happening in the upper troposphere, possible connection to the lower stratosphere. So we're looking at 100 to 300 hectopascals. But I am interested. So this paper is the paper I showed before that had the huge model spread in the CMIT5 response to CO2. And so I'm wondering if a part of the spread is because of this level dependence of response, that perhaps in this GISS model, the level of inflection is 300, but in the GFDL model, is that a little bit lower? Is it a little bit higher? Who knows? This is a little bit of an aside, but I think interesting as well. So describes the metrics that we're using, the analysis that we're moving forward with. So we're going to start by looking at connections within the troposphere of all these features. And we are showing, as I mentioned before, the steady state response to CO2. So again, steady state for us is 100 and 150 years. And we are looking at the response by season and by hemisphere. So these plots just show the steady state response as a function of forcing. I start with the Hadley cell edge just because this is a very robust result and it checks out. We see a poleward shift of the Hadley cell edge. I would say in most seasons, one exception is June, July, August, but it's interesting that in this model, you don't see an equatorward shift like the CMIP 5, CMIP 6 model mean would suggest. But typically you see a consistent poleward shift. How does this compare then to the width of the upwelling in the upper troposphere? Well, we see a narrowing of this upper tropospheric upwelling. We saw that in the previous slide, but this shows you how it's scaling with CO2. And so we see a narrowing for all seasons except for June, July, August in the northern hemisphere. I think perhaps that is just going to be an anomalous season for a lot of this analysis. But we also see that this upper tropospheric upwelling is strengthening. Oh yeah, did you have a question?
You mentioned the troposphere upwelling. Have you looked at the upwelling at the 850 millibar, that level?
No, not yet. We have not looked at that. We do have plans to look lower in the troposphere. I don't know, as low as 850, just to see how, again, that level dependence changes our results. But no, I don't have a reference for how. Have you looked at that?
No. I just wondering.
Yeah,
Really.
that's a good question.
So you mentioned the width of ITCZ. So you showed the ITCZ of the Siemens model.
Mhm.
They check the width of ITCZ, correct?
Yeah, the paper that I showed before, the Burn et al. 2018, they were showing the width of the ITCZ, but they were using a similar calculation as I was. They used the stream function to find that width. They didn't use upwelling motion
But I suggest you another pathway maybe give you more fruitful result.
Oh, in what way?
So don't check the width, check the center of the ITCZ, because according to Linden's paper, the Hadley circulation, if the heating center moving off the equator, that really makes a huge difference of width Hadley circulation.
Mm-hmm.
So if global is warming and moving like El Nino pattern, so that the center of heating is moving closer equator,
Mm-hmm.
so that the Hadley cell will naturally narrow according to Linden's theory. That is my suggestion.
Yeah, and I actually think that the calculation they use would accommodate for that, because they're not restricted by the latitude they're looking at. They're looking at the stream function itself, so they're looking at the circulation. So the movement off of the equator wouldn't impact their calculation. It would be able to capture that. But I should also point out we're not specifically looking at the ITCZ. We are mostly looking at this upwelling just in the upper troposphere to see if there's any connection with the lower stratosphere.
Because your result, most fascinating thing is narrowing of this operating branch. So you need to justify. Otherwise, you don't have new things in your presentation. The new thing is narrowing. So this can justify.
Sihan, she's going to talk about, she's focused on the connections between the upper troposphere and the lower stratosphere. That's new. People have not made that connection. So maybe we should wait until that's a new result.
Dr. Hansen, many years ago, believed the lower stratosphere upwelling is natural extension of Hadley circulation. So I don't see any difference between upper troposphere Hadley circulation and the lower branch for Brewer-Dobson circulation.
So she's going to show that there's actually some disconnects between that. I think people assume that they're connected, but I don't think it's a pretty tenuous link.
Okay.
Yeah, you may be surprised then with my results, but perhaps that's and I think, well, a lot of my work in my PhD was taking these long-held assumptions of circulation couplings and realizing it's not as simple as our prior assumption gave. And so it kind of applies to this work as well in many ways. So yes, so the upper tropospheric upwelling, we do see that narrowing, we do see that strengthening. In June, July, August is a bit of an exception, and in the southern hemisphere, that response is much smaller in general. Lastly, the subtropical jet, we do see it's strengthening, and I would argue it's strengthening, except for June, July, August in northern hemisphere. But what is interesting here is that I think there's some very apparent seasonality happening, whereas we see that the response of the winter and spring is materially larger than the response of the summer and fall. And not only that, but the response of the winter and spring in the northern hemisphere is a lot larger than the winter and spring response in the southern hemisphere. So this northern hemisphere response is actually a factor of 2 larger. However, even so, with this seasonality, with this hemispheric pattern, the 3 metrics, the upper tropospheric upwelling width, its strength, and the strengthening of the subtropical jet, shows consistent patterns in this way. They all have that same seasonality, and they have that similar hemispheric asymmetry. And this contrasts the Hadley cell edge response, whereas the Hadley cell edge, you see its response has more limited seasonality, and it also does not have a strong difference in response magnitude between hemispheres. And so our argument here, perhaps not a surprise if you know the disconnect between those mid to lower tropospheric metrics with the upper tropospheric metrics, but the upper tropospheric upwelling, its response is coupled to the subtropical jet strengthening, but those are disconnected from the Hadley cell edge and more of the mid-latitude circulation features. And then really quickly, I want to highlight the timescales of these features. In the gray, we see that the Hadley cell edge is responding really quickly in a matter of 8 years. This is a consistent result with CMET5 models, whereas the narrowing of the upper tropospheric upwelling is taking a little bit longer on the magnitude of about 50 years. The strength of the upwelling is similar to the narrowing. It's happening in about 50 years. And we see a similar timescale for the subtropical strengthening, and it's about 40 years, but I would argue that's still an intermediate timescale of response. All right, so to key points from our analysis with the tropospheric metrics. Seasonality, do we see seasonality in these features? Yes, we see that the upper tropospheric upwelling and subtropical jet, the response is larger in the winter and spring. The response is larger in the northern hemisphere than it is from the southern hemisphere. And they all seem to have similar transient responses to CO2, where they respond in about 40 to 50 years. Let's then repeat the same analysis for the stratospheric features and connections. We start by looking at the steady state response for this strength of the lower stratospheric upwelling, and we do find that it is strengthening for all seasons and hemispheres. The magnitude fluctuates a little bit, but it overall seems pretty consistent by qualitative understanding. There's also a narrowing of this lower stratospheric upwelling. This is consistent with an equatorward shift of the critical latitude. So recall, this is the latitude where the zonal line crosses 0 in the tropics. I should also note that this critical latitude is responding about double that of the narrowing of the stratospheric upwelling. So the right scale is for that shift. And then on that scale, we also see a strengthening of the lower stratospheric subtropical winds. So if we look at the seasonality and hemispheric patterns here, we actually see that there's quite limited seasonality for these metrics. Their response seems pretty comparable across all seasons. And the same would be true between hemispheres as well. I would point out just a couple exceptions to that is that if you look at the critical latitude response in the southern hemisphere, it's largest in the summer and fall. And I think what's interesting here is that this is the opposite response as you would see with the tropospheric metrics. Those tropospheric metrics, the largest response happened in northern hemisphere and it happened in winter and spring. But here, the critical latitude response is largest in the southern hemisphere for the summer and fall seasons. And then also something to point out is that the strengthening of the lower stratospheric zonal winds, that is actually, it's comparable across all seasons, but it is smallest and reduced in the northern hemisphere, summer and fall. But overall, if we look at these general conclusions, perhaps compare these connections to the tropospheric circulation features. Oh, I forgot. We also looked at the time scale quickly. The lower stratospheric upwelling width is responding in about 16 years. The critical latitude is slightly longer. It's responding in about 27 years. The strength of the upwelling, or perhaps the upward mass flux of the lower stratosphere, is responding in about 13 years. And then the lower stratospheric subtropical winds is responding in 32 years. And so you'll note that these timescales are just a little bit quicker than the tropospheric metrics. Those tropospheric metrics were responding greater than 40 years, between 40 and 50. But here we see between 20 and 30 years of a timescale. And so if we compare the two together, we see that for the stratospheric metrics, is there seasonality in those metrics? No, not really. It's pretty limited. We also see that there's a similar magnitude of response between those hemispheres, and they all have a bit of a quicker timescale of about 15 to 30 years. Okay, I'm actually doing pretty good on time. So I'm going to move to, okay, so the major conclusion here is that the upper tropospheric and lower stratospheric circulation responses to CO2 are distinct from one another. Otherwise, we would see similar consistent patterns across seasons, hemispheres, and in their transient response. What does this mean physically? Let's tie these conclusions back to the physical atmosphere. To visualize this better, in the troposphere, we do see evidence that there's a narrowing and strengthening of the upper tropospheric upwelling. This appears to be strongly coupled to the strengthening of the subtropical jet. However, these tropospheric features, their response to CO2, seems disconnected from what's happening in the stratosphere, where you see a strengthening of the lower stratospheric zonal winds, and this strengthening also is coupled to that narrowing and strengthening of the lower stratospheric upwelling. And so these are the major conclusions we find. Of course, this study is limited. This study has really, I think, highlights some of the connections that we can make between features and metrics. However, it really doesn't speak at all to the processes responsible for these changes. And so future work, we really want to dive into identifying the processes that induce the changes we see. And the goal is to use idealized simulations with the GISS model for this purpose. We see how all these features and metrics are responding to an increase in CO2. Do we see similar connections if we reduce the CO2 or get perhaps a global cooling? And then also wondering if we use SST forcing, be it fixed SST or SST induced only, will we start to disentangle some of the mechanisms involved? And also, there needs to be a test of robustness for these conclusions. So this is work only done with one model. Do these conclusions hold when you look at other coupled climate models? But also, do these relationships hold across the model hierarchy? So as you start simplifying models, can you further isolate the dynamics and the couplings to a point where you can identify the processes that are responsible for a result? So I will end there, and I would love to continue with questions. Yeah.
So what is the metric for you to study width of tropical upwelling in the troposphere.
Yeah, so we are looking at the stream function between 100 and 300 hectopascals, and we are finding where, actually, I'll go back to that figure. We're finding where that stream function is maximized.
Okay,
So
that is
where-
stream function. How about the lower stratosphere?
It's analogous, we're only looking at the stream function at 70 hectopascals.
So it's same diagnostic. That in other words, it's also stream function rather than transformed Eulerian stream function.
It is a residual stream function. So in the
Okay.
stratosphere, we're looking at that transformed Eulerian mean stream
So
function.
in the stratosphere, you look at the residual stream function.
Mhm.
In the troposphere, you look at the stream function.
Mhm.
So there is difference in term because the residual you have extra term v prime t prime, right?
Mhm.
But if you only study troposphere, it's justified. You study stream function. If you study stratosphere, it's justified with residual stream function.
Mhm.
Now you compare upper troposphere and lower stratosphere,
Mhm.
then you use different metrics. Is it justifiable?
As far as I've noticed, I haven't really seen anyone consider the stream function across that UTLS region. From what I know, we are the first to do so.
Yeah, you're a pioneer, but so you justify why
Yeah.
you use different metrics to study different regions. Then you compare the different, the narrowing, the weights.
Mhm.
You should use the same metrics. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Otherwise,
you would expect the TEM and the Eulerian and the tropics to be quite similar, right? The effect of those eddies.
it could be, but I think if you want to publish paper, you should use the same metrics.
Yeah.
I believe.
Or at the very least, use similar metrics to at least confirm the results.
Yeah.
So, if you don't mind, we'll rotate to one online and then we'll go back.
Okay,
Is that
yes.
fine? Because David had his
Oh,
Hi, David. I can see that you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Wonderful talk, very clear. I was just going to suggest that your discussion of wave breaking in the subtropics, or right at the border, being associated with upwelling. So we do have a standard diagnostics for all these runs, a latitude by altitude depiction of the DU/dt by EP flux divergence, by transformed advection. And one could see, for example, with respect to what's going on in the upper troposphere or lower stratosphere, what's really happening to the EP flux divergence at these different levels as a function of time, or associated with the transformed advection. And this gets to Tihan's comment about using the same metric. You could see the effect of the transformed advection as a function of altitude and time throughout the tropics in these X times CO2 experiments. So these might be diagnostics to assess as a function of time and altitude throughout the region.
Yeah. That'd be really interesting to look at those fields and confirm.
Thanks, David. So Allegra?
I was going to ask. So now that you're here, why stick with E21 instead of moving up to E22 with the better
Yeah.
Brewer-Dobson?
No, excellent point. And we have the same experiments done for 2.2, but at the time she started this analysis, we only had 2.1.
Okay.
That's the plan, to continue with the 2.2.
And then my second question is kind of sort of ish related. So the Hunga Tonga injecting just water vapor, like what happens if you, instead of forcing with CO2, you're forcing with the water vapor in the stratosphere?
Excellent. Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know. I have never thought of that. But that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that could be one such different forcing that we use and relevant, and so
Yeah,
we should
for
be doing
sure.
those kinds of runs.
I'm
So
pretty excited about the Hunga Tonga.
yeah. Well, I was talking to Robert about it. There's no kind of coordinated.
Yeah.
Gavin
effort
was saying,
now.
has said that Clara is coordinating a Hunga Tonga. I did talk to Gavin about it.
Okay. Well, it may be for CCMI, so we could do it for something like that. But
But we should, because Callistus and I looked at it in E21, but then there was a couple issues with stuff up there, so we need to redo it. But it would be better to do it E22 and
yeah.
Because before when we did it, like just water forcing it was kind of like ho-hum. It was like pretty boring, but now everybody's talking about it. It seems to be more exciting than we did all.
Yeah, and I think kind of looking at longer term
Yeah,
impacts.
the ozone interplay also I think will be super interesting coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge topic at the conference we were just at. It was a that'd be interesting.
That's a good point. So David, I see you have your hand up, but I think I saw Chris's first. Chris, do you want to ask a question?
I think, yeah, I just want to ask about and talk to me like I'm not like I need to brush up on my dynamics because I don't follow this too closely, but about this greater response in the jet, the anomalous jet in the northern hemisphere. Naively, I'm thinking about like thermal wind balance and increased baroclinicity in the upper troposphere when you have a moist adiabat response in the tropics, and but the northern hemisphere, at least transiently, warms more than the southern hemisphere. So I would sort of just intuitively think about this as getting an opposite pattern. So I'm just wondering what's setting that the greater anomaly in the northern hemisphere.
So you think the larger strengthening in the northern hemisphere seems like a signature of the larger warming happening in the northern hemisphere?
Well, I was thinking it would be the opposite if the upper atmospheric pole to equator temperature gradient wasn't changing as much as the southern hemisphere, but that's not what's showing. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think the tendency with subtropical jet, and I do this too, is to, I mean, thermal wind balance of course is holding, but there's this mindset that the temperature gradients are absolutely changing first, setting the zonal wind temperatures, and that may not be wrong, but I think also with the strengthening of the upwelling, could it be that strengthening of the poleward advection of angular momentum is helping strengthen the subtropical jets regardless of the warming, but then the thermal winds, is maintained, so then the temperatures respond to that poleward advection. That's something thermal winds you can never really tease out perfectly, or at least I haven't known anyone to do it, but I wonder if that would help explain perhaps the discrepancy of you're right, like the north, if you have that polar amplification, you're gonna get a reduced meridional temperature gradient. Does that show up specifically in the subtropics upper troposphere? Actually, we could look at, so here, you do, well, I don't have a pointer, but you do see that a part of the strengthening of that meridional temperature gradient is because there's cooling in the lower stratosphere at higher latitudes. And so you're right, there is going to be a reduced temperature gradient in the mid to lower troposphere, but when you're looking this high up, perhaps that cooling in the stratosphere is really setting those temperature gradients. So that also could be, again, a distinction between what's happening in the upper troposphere and what's happening in the mid to lower troposphere.
Temperature gradient could be irrelevant because when you have the Moriarty circulation, the air parcel move from equator to subtropics.
Yeah.
This momentum change is huge, hundreds of meters per second. So you have to use 80 to decrease it to reach the current level. So I think Moriarty circulation, advection of momentum flux, will dominate the role of this jet stream.
Yeah.
And the thermal stream, thermal wind balance just passively adjust to it, I believe.
If that's possible, I think if you are considering natural variability or just climatology, for sure. I think in trying to understand what's setting the response, though, we know that this temperature profile is happening. I think that polar advection of angular momentum is definitely playing a role, but I don't think anyone's really been able to decompose how much of the subtropical jet is strengthening due to that change in polar advection versus the change in just the temperature gradients. And I don't really know if there's a clean way to decompose that, but I think you're right in that shouldn't be neglected at all. But yeah, a lot of the literature just chalks up to thermal imbalance, and that's that.
Excellent. David?
Yeah, so in a way, following up on that point, mean, offhand, I suppose one would have suspected that both the upper troposphere change and the lower stratosphere or stratosphere change are driven by phenomena, wave phenomena primarily, from the troposphere. And it does raise the question, which you brought up with respect to the lower stratospheric cooling, how much is the stratosphere itself influencing that different response? And if you were looking for other forcings that might elucidate that, another possibility is increased solar irradiance, like 4% for 4 times CO2. Both Kevin and Clara have found that changing the stability in the stratosphere does seem to have an effect on upwelling in the stratosphere itself. And we know with increased CO2, you cool the upper stratosphere, and with increased solar radiance, you warm the upper stratosphere. So you might see if that's an example of how the stratosphere itself is playing a role in what's actually going on in the stratosphere.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. Yeah, that would, I think you're right that would help perhaps disentangle changes in the stratosphere relating to the troposphere. Yeah.
I'll just add too that Molly has looked at some fixed SST versions of these integrations, and those partly go towards explaining some of that disconnect, at least in the timescale response between the lower stratospheric and upper tropospheric metrics. In other words, why the stratosphere is responding a bit faster. So there you just have that kind of direct CO2 radiative component to it. So, using that tool too, in addition to some of these perturbations that you suggested, might also be useful. But, where in the vertical that happens, who knows? But yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thanks, David. Do we have any more questions online or in the room? Actually, we didn't give you applause. Do we have any more questions? No.
No. It
Okay.
feels like we're getting back to our old questioning selves again.
Good.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone online for coming, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Molly.
Thanks.
Recording.